now, Black Sabbath, whatever that tune was. Once 4 easy notes from Smoke on the Lake, a name that held the entire planet breathless. His fingers shouted stories, screamed, murmured, and occasionally wept. They didn't only play the guitar. Ritchie Blackmore, however, is more than a guitar legend. A musical talent driven with total control. He is a complicated phenomena, always losing the people around him. To supporters, he is a legend. To his bandmates, he is a suffering. Crushed beneath the burden of his own genius, the bands he headed from Deep Purple to Rainbow were both great and doomed. When the peaks of rock grew too loud, he didn't think twice to leave, escaping into a Renaissance fantasy universe, playing the lute and living like a knight out of time. Ritchie Blackmore is such a musical revolutionary who wouldn't accept mediocrity or an odd musician trapped in his own universe. A man who cannot love, or perhaps the only one courageous enough to be brutally honest with himself, even at the expense of great loneliness. Let's enter the world of a guy who, all for one conviction, dares to challenge the whole music business. Music is reality. Reality need not satisfy anyone. Ritchie Blackmore was born on April 14, 1945 in Weston-super-Mare, a quiet coastal village in England, where the soft waves lapping at the shore contrasted sharply with the musical maelstrom he would one day unleash on the globe. His family had no creative heritage, no stage, no spotlights, simply working-class parents and the burden of high expectations cloaked in silence. Blackmore's family relocated to Heston, Middlesex, where he spent much of his youth when he was 2. Everything, however, really started when he was 11. A tough old-fashioned guy, his father handed him his first guitar. There was no accompanying word of support, rather it arrived with a frigid order. Learn it correctly if you are going to. Don't just play about. There was no space for instinct or sloth. Ritchie started years of classical guitar study then, a surprising route for a child reared in the middle of a rock explosion. But those stiff, dry finger exercises laid the groundwork for what the world would eventually call a synthesis of Bach and Black Sabbath. Ritchie was a rebel in the classroom though. Dogmatic classes irritated him. He had little need for textbooks, and he often fought with instructors. The outcome, dropping out of school at age 15 and further disciplinary measures. For many that would have been a drop. To him, it was a means of escaping a system he did not trust. Blackmore started working as a radio technician at Heathrow Airport, a steady profession but one where he covertly pursued a new goal to become the best guitarist in England after leaving school. During the day, he repaired transmitters. At night, he strummed the guitar till his hands were numb. He didn't play for enjoyment. He played out of possession. Fortunately, a rare chance presented itself. He studied under Big Jim Sullivan, one of the most famous session guitarists in the UK at the time. Ritchie not only picked up technique, but also discipline under Sullivan's direction, something he rejected from everyone but music itself. But if technique was the bones, then emotion was the blood. The blood that flowed in Blackmore came from early performers he loved, Elvis Presley, Tommy Steele, and particularly Hank B. Marvin of the Shadows. Marvin's smooth, prolonged, dreamy tone created a lasting impression. Even in the most violent rock anthems, his impact would always resonate through Blackmore's solos. As a teen, some fantasized about summer vacations or schoolyard crushes, while I did too. Ritchie Blackmore quietly set off to start the path of reinventing how the world perceived a guitar with no bags, no goodbyes. Early career. If anything characterizes the early years of Ritchie Blackmore's career, it's not stardom, not the spotlight, but an unending wandering through nameless bands, tiny recording facilities, and dusty tours around England. During the early 1960s, barely 16 or 17 years old, Blackmore dove into the dynamic flow of British music like a lone wolf with nerves of steel. He became part of the Outlaws, a band often collaborating with the unusual producer Joe Meek. Ritchie discovered how to exist in the studio in Meek's odd universe of unusual sound effects and oral experimentation. Play it correctly, play it quickly, avoid errors. Yet he also picked up something even more crucial. You have to take charge if you want creative freedom. During those years, he never stopped moving, never stopped honing his craft. He played with anyone who needed a skilled guitarist, screaming Lord Sutch, Neil Christian, Hines, and countless unknown supporting acts. Blackmore wasn't afraid to experiment, but he never stayed long. To him, if the music wasn't sharp enough to make the listener jump, it wasn't worth his time. Ritchie once toured in Germany, where he became known for his aggressive playing style and a frigid, almost terrifying attitude. It was claimed he could derail an entire performance if the band couldn't follow one of his improvised solos, but that didn't bother him. Blackmore knew precisely what he wanted, and would never lower his standards to satisfy anyone else. Though not yet well known, his name was whispered behind the curtains in guitar circles. Looking for a scorching riff, call Blackmore. Fellow musicians respected him and feared him since he wasn't just good, he was demanding and completely uncompromising. By the mid-1960s, he came close to joining the legendary band the Yardbirds, but the chance vanished. That might have been fate, since Blackmore would soon create one of his own, instead of joining someone else's legacy. Blackmore would shortly produce one of his own, Deep Purple. After a fateful encounter with John Lord and Chris Curtis, former member of the Searchers, Ritchie was invited to join a new rock project in 1968. Originally called Roundabout, the band quickly changed its name to Deep Purple, after a song cherished by Ritchie's grandmother. Deep Purple was born with Ritchie Blackmore at the center of its sound, as if every piece of his life had been leading to this moment. From a high school dropout hunched over a guitar in a cluttered radio workshop, Blackmore now stood on the edge of a leap, no longer a hired hand, but the architect of a musical era. Career success. Deep Purple was never a place where Ritchie Blackmore blended in. It was where he claimed total control over sound. Blackmore pushed for the band's shift from psychedelic to hard rock. He didn't want nice melodies, he wanted the music to explode like war. He had to control every note to do that. 1970s Deep Purple in rock marked a turning point. No more drifting cover songs, but rather aggressive, muscular and technically demanding music. Starting with Speed King, where his guitar shredded through antiquated norms, Blackmore constructed riffs like fortifications. He took the guitar into uncharted territory with Child in Time, blending classical legato with haunting sustain. There was no question Blackmore was playing to tell a story driven by obsession, not to show off. Released in 1972, Machine Head is among the defining albums of worldwide hard rock, though the main riff was so straightforward that Blackmore allegedly came to loathe it. Smoke on the Water originated from a real-life tragedy. To him, it was a lackluster, uninspired riff that reflected his attitude. He had no desire for quick success. What he really took pride in was Highway Star, a solo he called a concerto in the style of Bach, but with the speed and fire of rock. His use of harmonic minor scales, pedal tones, and triad sequences transformed the guitar into a symphonic instrument. But while the music reached epic heights, the internal dynamics of the band started to fracture. Blackmore became cold and distant. Gillan, whose dramatic screams had become legendary, John Lord wanted to inject soul and funk into their sound. Blackmore despised that to the core. By the time Deep Purple changed course with Stormbringer, 1974, Blackmore had reached his breaking point. He left when the band declined to record Black Sheep of the Family, a song he considered a last warning. If Deep Purple was a battlefield of creativity, Blackmore's controlling personality drove John Lord more and more crazy. Rainbow would become an authoritarian kingdom of art, and Blackmore its unrelenting monarch. Rainbow started with Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow, 1975, a collaboration with Ronnie James Dio and members of Elf. From Man on the Silver Mountain, it was obvious this wasn't typical rock. The guitar was a sword, the vocals as prophecy, the riffs galloping like horses, and it was mythic opera. But Blackmore wasn't satisfied. He found the Elf members too ordinary for his vision. After the debut album, he fired them all, except Dio. In 1976, Rainbow released Rising, their artistic peak, considered one of the greatest albums in classic heavy metal. Stargazer, nearly 9 minutes long, blended classical music, hard rock, and Eastern epic tones. It was where Blackmore transformed his guitar into a string orchestra, and Dio into a biblical storyteller. But behind the brilliance was a silent hell. Jimmy Bain, bassist. You never knew when you'd get fired. Being in Rainbow was like walking a tightrope with a gun to your back. Tony Carey, keyboardist. Every word Ritchie said was a sarcastic jab, every single one. Cozy Powell, drummer. Once he was required to re-record a portion 50 times. I no longer knew what I was even playing, he remarked. From the sound, stage lighting, even to the arrangement of hotel rooms, Blackmore ran everything. Disagree, you're out. Not good enough, you're replaced. It was a musical machine of grandeur, but devoid of warmth. When Dio left in 1979 over frustration with the band's commercial direction, Rainbow started to change. Although the down-to-earth album with Since You've Been Gone was a commercial success, it lost Rainbow's original essence. Blackmore brought in Graham Bonnet, and then Jolene Turner in the early 19th. Voices more appropriate for radio than for legend. Rainbow put out Difficult to Cure, Bent Out of Shape, commercially successful but criticized for lack of depth. Blackmore stunned fans in 1984 by rejoining Deep Purple, though his relationship with Gillan stayed toxic. Perfect Strangers, 1984, showed Blackmore still played with fire. Though the emotional bond inside the band faded, the tours were successful. Ian Gillan once remarked, "I no longer knew what Blackmore wanted, perhaps everything, perhaps nothing." Blackmore departed Deep Purple for the last time in 1993, following a tumultuous concert in Helsinki, during which he tossed his guitar and walked off mid-show. No farewell, no explanation. Personal life. Ritchie Blackmore, throughout his blazing career, created timeless riffs and melodies that rocked the very foundation of the music business. But when the lights dimmed, and the guitar fell silent, he returned to a different space, one where the quiet between goodbyes defined most of his life. Blackmore regularly shunned talking about his private life in the media. The public knows about him only scattered fragments, names of wives, years of marriage, dates of separation. But if you look closely at those shattered pieces, a pattern emerges, one of loneliness, control, and self-destruction. In 1964, at age 19, Ritchie married Margaret Volker, a quiet German woman, almost the complete opposite of his temperament. They lived together briefly in Hamburg, where he played in bar bands. It was a time when Ritchie still had a touch of gentleness, as one close friend described. He didn't smile, but he didn't destroy everything yet. Margaret gave birth to his son Jürgen that same year, but fatherhood didn't tie Blackmore down. As Jürgen grew up, he was mostly absent, disliked changing diapers, and didn't know how to soothe the child. Their father-son bond stayed distant even if Jürgen followed in his footsteps as a guitarist, and later performed in the tribute band Over the Rainbow. They would meet more as fellow musicians than as family. Blackmore married Bärbel, a German dancer, in 1969, but the connection left no space for feeling. Bärbel later remembered in a rare interview, "I never knew what he was thinking, and he didn't think I needed to know." They shared a roof as two distinct beings. The marriage quietly disintegrated after only a few years. In the mid-1970s, at the height of Rainbow's splendor and turmoil, Blackmore entered a deep relationship with Shoshana Feinstein, a New York-born opera singer. They lived together in a house near Oxnard, California, and it may have been the only time in his life that Blackmore let someone into his musical world. Shoshana sang on 2 tracks from Rainbow's debut album, but it was their shared creative work that finally tore them apart. Ritchie accepted no errors. Shoshana was once instructed to re-record a line 28 times. In the studio, she wept, to which Blackmore callously replied, "If crying improves the pitch, then keep crying." She eventually departed without a word. Years later, she noted in her diary, "I loved a genius, and I survived that love like surviving an earthquake." Blackmore attempted marriage again in 1981, this time with Amy Rothman, an American woman, mostly unknown to the media. His patience, however, lasted only 2 years. They divorced in 1983, without providing a cause. A close friend once remarked that while he could survive 2 hours on stage under 3,000 burning lights, he couldn't handle breakfast with someone discussing the weather. Blackmore didn't meet someone who could make him stay, at least in some sense, until 1991 at age 46. Then a model and music journalist, Candice Knight, assigned to interview him. Candice Knight, then a model and music journalist, had no idea that interview would develop into a life spanning more than 3 decades. Instead of trying to change Blackmore, she entered his world, a peculiar universe of medieval music, reclusive living, and days spent playing the lute under the trees. She learned Latin to sing with him, wore Elizabethan gowns at their concerts, and most importantly, she never thought to heal him, something all the women before her had attempted. Not out of fear of commitment, but rather because, as Candice once remarked, all the commitment was already in the music. They were together for 15 years before marrying in 2008. With walls decorated with shields, swords, mandolins, and hand-forged iron candelabras, they reside in a Gothic-style house on Long Island. Raised without modern curriculums, Autumn, born 2010, and Rory, born 2012, are taught by Candice using fairy tales. Ritchie teaches them to hear chords in nature. "Do you hear that rain? That's a D minor. No iPads, no TikTok, just forests, books, lutes and history. Candace once remarked during a performance, "Ritchie isn't easy to love, but he's the only person I want to love in the hardest way." Musical style and legacy. If Jimmy Page was the wizard and Eric Clapton the soul of the blues, then Ritchie Blackmore was the lone swordsman. He didn't play the guitar, he struck it. Every note he played felt like a slash against familiar order, a defiance of the growing wave of easy trends. Blackmore's guitar style was a strange fusion of classical discipline and wild instinct, of tight Baroque structure and the erratic bursts of hard rock. He never played to satisfy a crowd. He played like a man trying to express something deeply personal, deeply buried, in a language only he could understand. From his earliest days with Deep Purple, he showed a musical mind far ahead of his time. While most guitarists of the era were still enamored with simple pentatonic scales and traditional blues licks, quietly weaving in harmonic minor scales, classical phrasing, and daring key changes, Blackmore, his music had total control, his emotions had total unpredictability. He could hold a single note for 4 seconds, as if his soul were trembling, and suddenly unleash a flurry of sharp tapping like blades slicing through silence. No one played like him, not because they couldn't, but because no one else dared to push emotion that far. No one else was ready to be that alone, to attain a sort of music almost divorced from the world. Blackmore seldom complimented others, but he openly admired 3 men, Jeff Beck, Jimi Hendrix and Eddie Van Halen. Of Jeff Beck, he remarked, "He has notes I don't have." Of Hendrix he admitted, "The first time I saw Hendrix play, I wanted to quit, since I realized I was just a shadow." Of Van Halen, he appreciated not just the revolutionary tapping technique but also the talent's kindness and innocence. He appreciated not just the revolutionary tapping technique of Van Halen but also the innocence and kindness behind the gift. From Yngwie Malmsteen, pioneer of neoclassical metal, to Brian May, Steve Vai, John Petrucci, or Kirk Hammett of Metallica, all were directly impacted by Blackmore, even if few are brave enough to acknowledge just how much they absorbed from him. Blackmore wasn't just a forerunner to them, he was a primal forest from which all styles branched out in various directions. You could leave that forest, but its wildness would always stay with you. Having left the world of Marshall amps, raging riffs and fiery tours, Ritchie Blackmore stepped into another dimension, since the late 1990s, where lutes took the place of Stratocasters, and Renaissance and folk music became his spiritual refuge. The Blackmore's Night Project was not merely a dalliance with ancient sounds, it was his way of escaping the modern world, a world he more and more felt alienated from. He wore 16th-century cloaks and played ballads on the nickel harpa in intimate concerts at medieval castles or pine woods in Germany, as if living in a dream no one dared to wake. To many it seemed like a retreat. To him it was finally the destination. Today, even if his name no longer graces magazine covers, as it did in the 70s, every time someone strums those first iconic notes of Smoke on the Water, Ritchie Blackmore is still present every time a young guitarist struggles to learn the solo from Stargazer, or whenever a symphonic metal song reverberates with tight mirrored patterns. He knows real music never has to explain itself, so no need for statements or declarations, and for those who get him, that narrative goes on in every quivering note, never fading. Current life and influence, Ritchie Blackmore keeps quietly, no noise, no proclamations, clinging to music as naturally as he breathes, while most rock legends of his era have either retired or live in the echoes of their past. Approaching 80, he no longer performs for crowds of tens of thousands, but still shows up often on smaller stages where the lights are gentle, the audience listens in silence, and Renaissance ballads resonate like whispers from a lost world. Blackmore keeps playing with the band Blackmore's Night, with his wife and longtime musical partner Ken. From Pennsylvania to Connecticut, Northampton to Red Bank, they traveled the U.S. in 2024, all carefully selected small concert halls, historic theaters, and even outdoor events under the moonlight, meant to capture the mood of an ancient musical masquerade. While Candace sang like a muse emerging from a fairy tale, Blackmore, in a black cloak, played lute, mandola, and even his old Stratocaster. No more metal screams, no thunderous drums, just earthy, slow, and hypnotic sounds. They kept touring the United States in April and May of 2025, stopping in cities including Greenwich, Inglewood, Phoenixville, Homer, and Bethel. Ritchie Blackmore has decided to return to music's purest beauty, even as the contemporary music scene is overrun with technology and stage effects. One instrument, one melody, one emotion. He doesn't need a crowd to feel loved, and those who truly love him don't need fireworks or flames, just a few quiet moments to be immersed in the sounds that once defined an era. Beyond performing, Blackmore also participated in the 25th anniversary reissue of Shadow of the Moon, the first Blackmore's Night album. This special edition was completely remastered with extra tracks, confirming that what once looked like a romantic side project has become an inseparable component of his musical legacy. Blackmore's influence endures even if he no longer appears on major media platforms or at commercial award ceremonies. From shred metal guitarists to prog rock, symphonic metal, and neo-folk artists, new generations of musicians all name him as an unofficial mentor, a pathfinder, for those daring enough to mix classical technique with contemporary energy. Blackmore never officially taught anyone, but he has motivated thousands to grab a guitar, not via textbooks, but via his solos themselves. Demanding, erratic, multi-layered and haunting. Stargazer, Gates of Babylon, Burn, Child in Time. These works are still analyzed, studied and reinterpreted, not to copy, but to grasp, for only by knowing how he plays, can one start to know how he views the world. Today, while many of his contemporaries have entered a nostalgic phase, Ritchie Blackmore stays unrelentingly inventive. He lives completely in a world he created for himself, writes new songs for Candice, and plays around with ancient instruments he'd never touched before. One where every sound has a soul, where history is not the past, but the present reenacted every day. He never sought to become a legend, but his isolation, his faith, and his radical difference have made him one of the most unique characters rock has ever produced. Have made him one of the most unique characters rock has ever created. He doesn't have to talk. He survives as an underground current, influencing every note, every idea, every student who never met him in person. And maybe that is the sort of greatness no prize could ever quantify. What do you think about Ritchie Blackmore's one-of-a-kind path? Which era, song, or performance left the most profound impression on you? Leave your comments below, and if you think that genuine music still merits to be heard, hit like and subscribe to help us find more untamed music world legends. Ritchie Blackmore, a lone eccentric, but a flame that never fades in the hearts of those who believe that music first and last must be the most honest thing a human being can ever speak.